Hi, my name is Michael Jackson.
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 With the real Michael Jackson.
There's a man standing in a hotel lobby in Tokyo, dressed head to toe like the king of pop. The sequined glove, the loafers, the single white sock, all of it exact, all of it rehearsed 1,000 times in front of a mirror before this moment ever happened. Another man is pinned against a wall by security outside a courthouse in California, hands up, being asked for identification, because for one confusing second, a group of strangers were absolutely convinced they were looking at Michael Jackson himself. A third is sitting at an award show table in Los Angeles, shaking hands with a face that looks like it walked straight out of 1987, except it's 2025, and the man on the other side of that handshake is family. None of them are Michael Jackson. But for a few seconds, in front of a camera, or a screaming crowd, or Michael himself, they didn't need to be anyone else. They just needed to be close enough. 4 decades, Michael Jackson wasn't just the most famous performer on the planet. He was the most copied one. Kids practiced his spin in bedroom mirrors from Manila to Manchester. Street performers borrowed his glove for a few dollars a photo outside train stations and tourist landmarks. But every so often, imitation stopped being casual. It stopped being a costume pulled out once a year for a talent show or a Halloween party. It became a craft, a discipline, almost a second identity. A handful of men studied him so closely, for so many years, frame by frame, step by step, that they stopped looking like fans and started looking like reflections standing just outside a mirror. And the strangest part of their story isn't that they looked like Michael Jackson. Plenty of people, over the decades, have looked like Michael Jackson for an afternoon. The strangest part is what happened when Michael Jackson looked back. When the man they had spent a decade or more becoming finally turned, made eye contact, and reacted, sometimes with laughter, sometimes with a compliment, sometimes with a level of scrutiny that only the real Michael Jackson could ever offer. This is the story of 6 men who spent their lives becoming someone else's shadow, and the extraordinary moments when that shadow finally stepped into the light next to the real thing. Before we get into their individual stories, it's worth pausing on just how rare this actually is. Impersonation is common. Every major celebrity attracts a wave of lookalikes eventually, at malls, at parties, on street corners. What's rare is a lookalike who gets close enough to the original to be tested by them, judged by them, and ultimately accepted, even briefly, by them. That's not luck. That's years of unpaid, unseen effort finally colliding with the right moment. Keep that in mind as you go through each of these 6 stories, because the meeting itself is never really the beginning. It's the ending of a much longer, much lonelier journey that started long before anyone was watching. Let's start with the one whose resemblance came closest to erasing the line between the two of them entirely. His name is Casanova, and unlike most impersonators who start with a costume rack, he started with obsession. He didn't just copy the outfits hanging in a costume shop. He copied the walk, the half-turned glance thrown back over the shoulder, the exact snap of the wrist mid-spin, the subtle way Michael's chin tilted before a big note. Every gesture was rehearsed over and over, hundreds of times, in empty rooms, until it stopped looking rehearsed at all and started looking involuntary, the way it did for the real man. His break came early, back in 1989, when he played a Michael Jackson-styled android waiter in Back to the Future Part 2. It was a small role tucked inside a massive blockbuster, easy to miss if you blinked, but it put him on a radar that mattered far more than screen time ever could. Within a few years, people connected to Michael's own productions started noticing the resemblance, and not in a casual, isn't that funny kind of way. They noticed it professionally. He began picking up work as a body double, standing in on projects tied directly to Jackson himself, doing the kind of behind-the-scenes work that never makes the credits but absolutely shapes the final product. Then came the moment that still circulates online today, more than 3 decades later, popping back up on forums and video essays every few years like clockwork. A single photograph, 2 Michael Jacksons sitting side by side on a production set, so close in appearance that even people who worked with Jackson day in and day out reportedly had to do a double take when they first saw the image. The internet still asks the same question every single time that picture resurfaces. Which one is the real one? Zoom in, and you still can't be completely sure. Casanova never claimed to be Michael. He never wanted to be. What he wanted, in his own words, was to keep something alive on stage, for audiences who would never get another chance to see the real show, who were either too young to catch him live or lived somewhere the tour never reached. That's how he still talks about it, decades later. Not as an act, not as a gimmick, but as a tribute that outlived the man it was built to honor, carried forward night after night by someone who studied him more carefully than almost anyone alive. But Casanova's story, as strange as it gets, isn't the strangest one on this list. Because at least one impersonator claims he didn't just perform as Michael Jackson for an audience. He worked as him, in the middle of actual, physical chaos, to protect the real one. Meet Navi. Born in Trinidad, he started chasing Michael's image at just 15 years old, a kid so committed to the transformation that he was already being mistaken for a grown superstar before he had even finished growing up himself. Think about that for a second. A teenager, barely old enough to drive, already convincing enough that strangers on the street would stop, stare, and whisper his name, except it wasn't his name at all. By the time he was in his 20s, the resemblance wasn't a hobby anymore. It was a full-time job. And it was, by his own account, a genuinely dangerous one. Here's how it reportedly worked. When Michael Jackson needed to leave a hotel, an airport, a venue, anywhere fans and photographers were waiting in the hundreds or the thousands, Navi would step out first. Dressed exactly like Michael. Moving exactly like Michael. The crowd would surge toward him instantly, certain they had just spotted the real king of pop walking past. Cameras flashed in every direction. People screamed his name, or rather, Michael's name. And somewhere behind that wall of noise and flashing lights, the actual Michael Jackson would slip out through a completely different exit, unnoticed, while the crowd chased a decoy who wasn't even trying to run. Navi has described what that moment feels like from the inside, being pursued by 2,500 people who are 100% convinced you're someone else, someone far more famous than you'll ever actually be. He calls it terrifying, plain and simple. He also calls it the closest thing he'll ever have to understanding what Michael's daily life actually felt like, every single day, for decades, with no decoy standing in for him. His connection to Jackson didn't stay confined to the shadows forever, either. In August 2003, during Michael's 45th birthday celebrations, Navi was given an actual stage and a medley of Michael's biggest songs to perform, with Michael himself reportedly sitting in the room watching. It went well enough, by most accounts, that he was later invited out to Neverland Ranch, a place most fans only ever see through iron gates and long camera lenses. 2 years after that, during the 2005 trial that put Michael's entire life under a global microscope, Navi didn't stay away or distance himself the way plenty of associates quietly did. He flew from London to California specifically to stand outside the courthouse in support, day after day, and even managed to secure a seat inside the actual courtroom through the public lottery system that was set up for ordinary members of the public. He talks about that period carefully, almost protectively, describing a man who was determined to fight the case properly the second time around, after feeling that silence and misunderstanding had cost him dearly the first time. Navi says he personally watched Michael's highs and his lows up close during those years, not as a performer studying material for a role, but as someone who genuinely cared how the story ended for a person he considered a mentor and, in some sense, a friend. That history, the stage time, the loyalty through the darkest years, the sheer number of years spent inside Michael's mannerisms until they became second nature, eventually opened a door that most tribute artists never even get near. In 2017, Navi was cast to portray Michael Jackson in the Lifetime film Michael Jackson, Searching for Neverland. A lifetime of impersonation had quietly turned into an actual acting credit, playing the very man he had spent decades trying to become, night after night, on stages most people never thought twice about. Not every lookalike found Michael through work, though. Some found him the way millions of ordinary fans dream about late at night, through nothing but sheer, stubborn persistence. That's Carlo Riley's story. Known online as Almost MJ, Riley is a Denver-based tribute artist whose face already carried a natural resemblance to the older, later-era version of Michael, the sharper cheekbones, the longer hair, the softer features of the man's final years. But natural resemblance only gets you so far, and Riley knew it. He spent years refining everything else on top of that starting point, the wardrobe stitched to match specific eras, the hairstyles adjusted season by season to track what Michael himself was doing at the time, the tiniest facial expressions practiced until they looked unconscious instead of performed. This wasn't a costume he pulled out for parties. This was closer to a second skin. What he wanted more than anything, though, wasn't fame, and it wasn't bookings. It was one single meeting. Just one. In March 2007, that chance finally arrived. Michael was in Tokyo for an exclusive event marking the 25th anniversary of Thriller, and only a few hundred fans in the entire world were allowed inside. Riley made absolutely sure he was one of them, dressed in a carefully rebuilt version of Michael's later era look, right down to the smallest accessories. When Michael's eyes eventually landed on him in that crowd, witnesses say he did a visible, unmistakable double take before stepping over and shaking his hand. He complimented the outfit directly. The entire interaction lasted only a matter of seconds. For Riley, it was the payoff for years of obsessive, unglamorous detail work, finally confirmed by the one single opinion in the entire world that actually mattered. That moment in Tokyo turned out to be the beginning, not the end, of Riley's connection to the wider Jackson family. Over the years that followed, he was present at an event honoring Michael's father, Joe Jackson. He met Michael's longtime costume designer, Michael Bush, the man responsible for many of the outfits Riley had spent years trying to replicate stitch for stitch. He crossed paths with Janet Jackson and Prince Jackson at various points, and eventually met Michael's mother, Katherine Jackson, someone most fans only ever see from a distance at public appearances. He even went further than most tribute artists ever would, undergoing cosmetic rhinoplasty at one point specifically to sharpen a resemblance that had already, on its own, opened more doors than he ever expected. Riley's path shows exactly what pure devotion, applied patiently over years, can eventually build. But the next lookalike took a very different route entirely, turning his resemblance into something closer to a full international career, complete with product endorsements, packed venues, and a level of physical danger most casual fans never stop to think about. His name is Ernest Valentino, a Florida-born performer who became one of Europe's most recognized Michael Jackson tribute artists throughout the 1990s and 2000s. Like Navi, Valentino sometimes worked as a decoy, stepping out into public view after tour stops so the real Michael could exit through a quieter route while the crowd chased the wrong man entirely. He describes the work bluntly as a genuinely dangerous job, one that occasionally cost him his costume, literally torn apart at the seams by overexcited fans who were absolutely certain they had their hands on the real king of pop and weren't about to let go without a souvenir. For Valentino, though, the resemblance was never just physical, never just about the jawline or the hair. He immersed himself completely in the choreography, the specific stage presence, the tiniest habits and tics that separated a decent tribute act from a genuinely convincing one that could fool people at a distance and sometimes even up close. That level of dedication reportedly opened commercial doors as well. Around 1996, he became connected to promotional work tied to a Jackson-branded beverage launch, putting his face and his performance directly behind a product that carried Michael's name and image. But the encounter Valentino talks about most, even decades later, happened on June 15, 2002, at the Equinox in London, during the Killer Thriller tribute event. Valentino took the stage that night and delivered a high-energy set built around some of Michael's biggest songs, including Jam and Billie Jean, in front of a packed, electric crowd. Somewhere in that venue, reportedly watching from a private balcony above the floor, was Michael Jackson himself, taking in a performance built entirely around imitating him. The two would later meet backstage after the show, an almost impossible situation to fully process, where Valentino had just finished performing as Michael Jackson while the real Michael Jackson was sitting in the same building watching him do it. His support for Michael didn't stop at the stage door, either. During the difficult stretch of Michael's 2005 trial, Valentino traveled all the way to California and stood outside the courthouse during jury deliberations, just like Navi did around the same time. And in one particularly surreal moment caught on camera, Valentino himself was stopped by courthouse security, treated for a few genuinely tense seconds like a suspicious figure who needed to explain his presence, before calmly clarifying, again, that he was simply an impersonator who happened to look almost exactly like the man everyone in that crowd was actually there to see. Valentino's story is proof that resemblance alone was never really the whole job. Recognition from Michael himself, even briefly, even backstage, away from any cameras, meant more to him than any payday or any sold-out show ever could. Not every tribute artist chased the choreography or the crowd work, though. One of them became obsessed with something far more specific, far more technical, and in some ways far more difficult to fake convincingly, the clothes themselves. Meet Christopher Gasper. While other impersonators focused their energy on movement and stage presence, Gasper poured almost all of his attention into wardrobe accuracy, treating Michael's stage outfits less like costumes bought off a rack and more like museum pieces that needed to be rebuilt from scratch, thread by thread, with historical precision. During the Dangerous and History eras especially, Michael's look had become almost as iconic as the music itself, military-style jackets covered in medals and braiding, metallic detailing that caught stage lights a certain way, dense embroidery running down the sleeves, precisely placed buckles and insignias that meant something specific to people who paid close enough attention. Gasper studied all of it obsessively, reportedly working to match the exact materials, the specific stitching patterns, and the decorative elements originally created by Michael's longtime costume designers, Michael Bush and Dennis Tompkins, the two men most responsible for the visual language of Michael's biggest tours. That obsession with technical detail eventually carried his tribute shows across international stages, including performances and television appearances throughout Europe and South America, places where audiences may never have seen Michael live but had absolutely seen photographs of every outfit he ever wore. But the real test of all that work came backstage, in a private meeting with Michael himself, with Gasper dressed in one of his fully rebuilt, painstakingly accurate stage uniforms, standing in front of the one man on Earth qualified to spot a single mistake. According to accounts of that meeting, Michael's reaction wasn't polite indifference or a quick, forced smile for a fan. It was reportedly a genuine double-take, followed by a much closer, more deliberate inspection of the outfit itself, the kind of attention only someone who had personally approved every version of that costume could give. Michael was famously particular about every single inch of his stage wardrobe, down to buttons most audiences would never even notice from the seats. He reportedly studied Gasper's replica piece by piece, and complimented the stitching and the pattern work specifically, by name, the way a craftsman recognizes another craftsman's work. For a man who had spent countless hours trying to recreate details most audiences would never consciously register, that reaction was the ultimate validation available to him. He hadn't just fooled a crowd from 30 rows back. He had impressed the one person on Earth who actually knew, better than anyone alive, what the real thing was supposed to look like, thread by thread, button by button. And then there's the story that belongs to a completely different generation entirely, one where the meeting didn't even need Michael Jackson himself to still happen, because the resemblance had already outlived him. Meet Fabio Jackson, a British content creator born on June 13, 1993, who built a massive online following on platforms like TikTok almost entirely because of his uncanny resemblance to the King of Pop, a resemblance he leaned into fully rather than hiding from. Fabio never met Michael. He couldn't have, given the timeline. But in one of those strange, almost impossible coincidences the internet absolutely loves to circulate, he ended up meeting the next best thing available to him. The moment happened at the AFI Lifetime Achievement Awards in Los Angeles, where Fabio was attending as a +1 guest of a filmmaker friend, nothing more than a normal invite to a normal industry event. By pure, almost unbelievable chance, he ended up seated at the exact same table as Jaffa Jackson, Michael's own nephew, who plays his uncle in the biographical film Michael. Two versions of the same unmistakable face, separated by an entire generation and by actual bloodline, sharing a table at an award show that neither of them could have predicted would put them side by side. The clip of the two of them meeting, shaking hands, exchanging a few warm, genuine words of encouragement, spread fast online, racking up views from people who couldn't quite process what they were looking at. Fabio has described the moment simply, as something that felt surreal in the best possible way, watching someone else carry that same unmistakable resemblance he had spent years building an entire online career around, except this time, it wasn't a stranger doing an impression. It was family, carrying the real thing forward into a new medium entirely. 6 different men. 6 completely different paths into Michael Jackson's orbit, some planned for years, some the result of a single lucky coincidence. One became a decoy in the middle of screaming, grabbing crowds, risking his own safety so someone else could walk away safely. One became a backstage guest whose handmade costume got inspected stitch by stitch by the most demanding critic imaginable. One became an actor cast to formally play the very man he had spent a lifetime imitating for free, in empty rooms, for no audience at all. One simply refused to stop showing up, year after year, until the door finally, unexpectedly opened for him in a foreign city. And one didn't even need Michael Jackson to be there in person, because by 2025, the resemblance itself had become the whole story, powerful enough to carry its own weight without the original ever needing to witness it. What ties every one of them together isn't the wig, or the glove, or the moonwalk that so many people can technically attempt but so few can actually land convincingly. It's the years. Nobody on this list got close to Michael Jackson by accident, and nobody stumbled into it overnight. Every single meeting, every double take, every quiet backstage handshake was the delayed payoff for a decade or more of obsessive, unglamorous, mostly unseen repetition, studying old footage frame by frame late at night, rebuilding costumes stitch by stitch with no guarantee anyone important would ever see them, practicing a walk in an empty hallway until it finally stopped looking practiced at all and started looking involuntary. And maybe that's the real reason these stories keep going viral over and over, years after Michael Jackson himself left the stage for good. Because somewhere in each of these men, there's a small piece of what made Michael Jackson himself so impossible to look away from in the first place. Total, uncompromising commitment to the illusion, whatever it took, for however long it took. The difference is, for 6 men, that illusion eventually became convincing enough, detailed enough, sincere enough, to make the actual man stop, turn around, and shake the hand of someone who had built an entire second identity in his image. If you've made it this far, you already understand why this particular topic refuses to die down online, resurfacing in comment sections and video essays year after year. It was never really about impersonators pretending to be someone famous for a cheap laugh or an easy photo opportunity. It's about how far genuine devotion can carry an ordinary person right up to the edge of the extraordinary life they spent years quietly studying from a distance, with no promise it would ever amount to anything at all. So the next time you scroll past someone in a sequined glove and a single white sock, resist the urge to write it off as just another costume. Somewhere behind that outfit might be a story just as strange, just as dedicated, and just as unbelievable as the 6 you just heard. Because for every one of these men, looking like Michael Jackson was never really the finish line they were chasing. Meeting him was. Being seen by him, even for a few seconds, was the entire point of everything that came before it. And for at least one of them, it didn't even stop there. It turned into a formal role, a movie credit, a permanent, documented place in the story of the King of Pop's legacy, something no amount of practice alone could ever have guaranteed on its own. That's the thing about chasing a legend closely enough, and for long enough, without ever knowing whether it will actually pay off. Every once in a while, against long odds, the legend notices you chasing him. And when he finally does, when the recognition comes from the one person whose opinion could never be faked or bought, it changes absolutely everything for the person standing on the other side of that moment. Thanks for watching. If this kind of deep dive into the people orbiting the world's biggest icons is your thing, there is a lot more of it coming, so make sure you stick around for what's next.